I think that the first important aspect of jazz that it embodies of our way of life is improvisation, which gives you personal freedom to change things. Then the second one is swing, which means other people have freedom. Then you have the responsibility to balance the ecosystem with them as they invent things. And the third is the embrace of the blues. And the blues also has a lot in common with many forms of Japanese music, the pentatonic scale, and it's a form that is optimistic without being naive. And it's important to pass those traits down to other generations because the generations have to be linked in a continuum. It creates comfort and it allows for the transferal of the most important knowledge through ritual and a continuation of a way of life. And in a way, that type of comfort actually creates more peace because when people have anxiety, they resort to violence and ignorance. I learned how to play jazz from Art Blakey. I played in his band when I was 18. He gave me the opportunity to learn how to play. I think one of the tours I went to Japan was with Art Blakey. He was a national hero. But I think that he was the embodiment of the ideals of the music because he gave you a structure to play in, but the freedom to find yourself. I was also the music director of the band at a very young age. And he had a lot of trust in me and a lot of belief. So I learned those things. But for me, philosophically, it's people like Ralph Ellison and Albert Murray and Stanley Crouch. They were more like my philosophical gurus that taught me about the democratic proposition and more of the literary underpinnings of the relationship of jazz to the work of different American artists and to our foundational documents and concepts. I just think classical traditions are those that are safeguarded for the future, and they represent the most refined form of a way of expression. And I think I was fortunate to have a father who was a music teacher, and he liked a lot of different music and always encouraged me to study music past the prejudice in the way they were presented. So I was able to listen to Haydn's music and Beethoven's music, Shostakovich's music, Bartok's music, and not equate it with a form of repression. And I love the music. So too the music and the classical traditions. And I also love the folk traditions. So I love the folk traditions, the primitive art traditions, the popular art tradition, and the fine art traditions. They all have different functions and purposes. My father was everything in terms of my consciousness because I saw him struggle trying to play music people didn't want to hear. And he could play, he practiced a lot, but he was largely playing in clubs with very few people. And it was interesting because he believed in the music. And after my brother and I came out and we became more known, his celebrity increased. But he was always serious about playing. And he taught me the value of integrity because he truly was playing for no one. And he believed in it. I learned many things from my father. One of the greatest lessons, he taught also our high school class. In the beginning of the class, he would sit us in 4 chairs, and each chair would be back to back. And he would ask each person to describe what they saw in the room. So one person would describe there, so another person would describe there, another one there, and another one. Then he would say, okay, yeah, you see that, yep. Then at the end of that, he would say, now all of us heard the descriptions, and they're all very different. Do we all accept that we're in the same room? And that made us all understand there are different perspectives based on what you can see. But because you can see something doesn't mean other things are not there to be seen. And he was great at those types of fundamental lessons. His integrity was something that it's not possible to forget. And I try all the time to make him proud. My entire life I was interested in slavery because I grew up in segregation in the South of the United States during the Civil Rights Movement. And when I was young, I went to a museum called the Cabildo that had all of the slave chains and all of the trappings of it. And we received a comic book about Frederick Douglass. So I read about the great Frederick Douglass, who was a large part of the movement away from slavery in America. And growing up in the segregation, the 100-year segregation that came about after the South lost the Civil War, It was always the subject of my term papers when I was in school, in high school, in elementary school. I read a lot of the literature, a lot of slave narratives. So it was natural for me to talk about it. And then knowing in the biblical tradition of the West, the Old and the New Testament, is a dialogue with slavery. In my time, it was Martin Luther King, and the time of Martin Luther King and Lyndon Johnson and John F. Kennedy and the Vietnamese War. And these were things that you heard about all the time. And the tribulations of integration, I went through that. It was very difficult. And so it's a very natural subject. You know, I was 3 generations removed from slavery. My great-grandmother and great-grandfather were the sons and daughters of slaves, so it was not that far removed. It is the music at this point of the American conscience, of the conscience of the country. The country did not embrace the art form because it's difficult for us to embrace things on that higher level that come from black people. So because of that difficulty, it was replaced by rock and roll, which is a popular form. The world's racial relationship needs to improve because the kind of color line that I see in the world, in the North versus South, it does not serve humanity. And indeed, it puts us in very difficult equations. So still in our country, we have to work that equation out, and we're a long way from it. But in other places in the world, there are other equations that they have to work out. And jazz is a music that can heal those divides. Receiving this award is great meaning, first because it is my 62nd birthday, but also because I have a very long and deep respect for Japanese people and the customs and tradition and art, and many connections throughout the years. I recorded my first record, half of it, in Japan when I was 19. At a certain point, the Japanese jazz fan kept jazz in the forefront of culture for American artists. If American jazz musicians in the 90s or 80s were going to Japan, you would give them a list of records you wanted. Man, if you go to Japan, get this record, get this record. The Japanese people carried the discography that was started in France to a much higher level with the Swing Journal and the different magazines.